Welcome back to the channel, RacerX here, and today I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I really like about the Mustang, but I also want to talk about some things that I don't like about the Mustang. So really it's going to be 5 things that I love and 5 things that I hate about the Ford Mustang. So if you're unfamiliar with the Mustang platform, hopefully this will help you out a little bit. Also, one thing that I have noticed is only about 20% of you guys watching this video are actually subscribed to my channel, which is a little surprising, but hey, if you're new to my channel, do me a big gigantic favor. I would really appreciate it if you subscribe. I have all sorts of really fun things planned for the end of this year, moving into next year. It should be a lot of fun. And so without any further ado, here we go. So having this car now for a few months, it's given me plenty of seat time. And obviously with seat time, you find things about cars that you both like and dislike. And there are some things about the Ford Mustang that I don't particularly like. And the first thing I want to talk about is obviously, you know, when the way this thing drives, it's so different than the Mopars I've driven, than the Chevys that I've driven. The fact is this thing screams up top. But when it comes to low end punch and low end torque, this is a smaller displacement than those other cars I just mentioned. 5 liters, naturally aspirated. I do absolutely love the way this thing looks on this drag pack, but in terms of just coming off the line, this thing is relatively sluggish. I just had this out to the track. As we saw, the best I could do with my 60 foot was like 1.7 something, and that is pretty typical for a car like this without an aftermarket converter, and it just smaller displacement. It doesn't make as much torque, 420 pound-feet of torque, even though it makes 460 horsepower. So it is definitely something to consider on this. The low end torque is considerably less than it is on the comparable cars in its class, i.e. the Scat Pack and the Camaro SS. It just doesn't come off the line as quickly as you would expect, or as quickly as you would hope, because of that torque deficit. Once it gets up top, obviously it screams. So it does take some getting used to. So that's the first thing. So another thing that I noticed about this particular platform, which I thought is a little bit weird because so many people like to actually modify their Mustangs. It's one of the most highly modified cars out there. There are a couple of really noticeable weak points on this particular platform. One being the axles. These things have actually snapped stock axles, like when you put it in drag mode, because it does shift so hard. I've seen guys actually with stock power actually break axles in these cars. They're just not really all that robust. And then the oil pump gears in these, the exact same thing. You would think they would put billet oil pump gears in these cars from the factory, but for some reason they don't. And the oil pump gears are a huge pain in the butt to install on these things. Basically the whole front of the engine has to come off, and you guys may have seen that in one of my previous videos. But just replacing something as simple as oil pump gears in these so that it'll hold more power can be a huge pain and require a lot of labor. So a couple of weak points of note. And something else I really wanted to bring up was not so much on the automatic transmission in this car, but on the manual. So the manual is an MT82 in this. It's a 6-speed. And I have to mention, I've driven several of these manual cars, and they really just aren't all that great. And they just feel sluggish. They're a little bit cumbersome. I just really don't like the manual cars in these at all. And they are significantly slower than their counterparts in the automatic. Now, when you talk about something like a Mach 1 or a Shelby, they put a really nice transmission in there. That's the TR3160, and a completely different deal on those cars. But for some reason, the EcoBoosts and the GTs of the world got the cheaper and really not even close to as good of transmission on the 6-speed, and I'm just not a huge fan of the manuals in these cars. So the next thing I want to talk about is something I've noticed on a lot of other Mustangs. Mine is actually really not too bad, and you could really say this for a lot of the American-made muscle or sports cars, but the body gaps in this thing are really, they're kind of rough. Well, let's put it that way. My car actually is a lot better than a lot of other Mustangs that I have seen, but I mean, when you talk about body gaps on some of these, they're very inconsistent, and I realize you could say, well, RacerX, that's pretty much the case with all of the the American sports cars. I mean, you see it a lot, and you know what? That's true. That's a true statement. But on these cars, I do notice it quite a bit in terms of just body gaps. I mean, like the gap, it's a little hard to see with the sun, guys, but I mean, the gap here is just huge. I mean, I've noticed some gaps in mine. Mine, like I said, is not quite as bad as some of the other ones that I've seen, but definitely some body gap issues on a lot of these Mustangs that I've seen, and it's just something to consider. The last thing I want to address about things I don't like about the Mustang, and maybe it doesn't bother some people as much as it bothers me, but I mean, you do literally see Mustangs just about on every corner, and they don't do a whole lot to differentiate between the Mustang GT and, say, the EcoBoost of the world. The body is essentially identical. And yes, I realize they have Performance Pack 1 and Performance Pack 2 cars out there or whatever, but I mean, the body itself is essentially identical to what an EcoBoost is. Now, I realize the lines are really blurred when it comes to Dodge, because Dodge has all these different trim levels, and they started making the GT that looks like the RT, and the RT doesn't look all that different from the Scat Pack, and so forth and so on. Chevy does a little better job of differentiating their V8 from their V6, but then again, they came out with the LT1, and that one is essentially identical to a V6 with a V8 power plant. So I realize there's kind of some of that, but there's so many EcoBoosts out there. They look just like a GT, except for that little badge on the side and the GT in the back. I mean, there's no difference at all in the way these things look. So I kind of wish Ford would do a little more to make these V8 cars stand out. Now, I didn't want to do this video without mentioning this, and I didn't want to make this one of my full talking points, but it's almost like a 5B, so to speak. But the fact that they're still using a prop rod on the Ford Mustang is just flat ridiculous in 2021 going into 2022. I mean, you know, the hood struts really aren't all that expensive. You would think that that would be one of the first things they would want to change. It's very easy to change, but yeah, we're still using prop rods. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I actually really like about the Mustang. And I do realize I'm a relative newcomer to the Mustang platform, so to speak, but I do really enjoy driving this car. So the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that it's light. I mean, it's 3,700 pounds fully loaded, and if you're used to driving like a Mopar or something like that, this thing feels really nimble and really light when you drive it. It's actually quite enjoyable. It doesn't take nearly as much power to get this thing moving really, really fast. And like I said, you do notice it when you drive the car. So really, that's another big thing. The Mustang is just really light compared to some of the other stuff that's out there. So the second thing that I want to bring up, and this is one of the most glaring things, is the fact that the Mustang is just so moddable. Yeah, I mentioned before, it's one of the most modded cars you're going to find out there. A lot of people like to mod their cars, but I mean, there is so much aftermarket support for the Ford Mustang, regardless of the year that you have, pretty much. I mean, there's a lot of folks out there that like modding these cars, and this Coyote is a very robust engine. That's why I picked it, right? I'm working with Hellion, and this one, as we know, is twin turboed, and it is very, very fast, and these engines will hold a lot of boost. So whether you like keeping these things naturally aspirated or you want to go with a boosted application, these things take really well to mods, and that it's just a really good platform for that. Plus the fact, as I mentioned before, it is light. So I've seen guys literally keep these things naturally aspirated, just put like headers and then go with like a tune E85, and these things will literally get into the high 10s just by doing that. So they respond really, really well to mods. And then, you know, it's all gravy once you start boosting it, because for some reason the Coyote, being a dual overhead cam, 4 valves per cylinder, it breathes really well up top, so it does fantastic with boost. So definitely something to think about when it comes to these Mustangs. Now, one of the other things that I want to bring up, and this is kind of a big one, and another major reason that I really do like the Ford Mustang, is the automatic transmission in this thing. Obviously, this is a 10-speed transmission. We know that Chevy has kind of the same transmission, and it's fantastic in that platform as well. But for some reason, the Coyote made it to this 10-speed automatic is really what makes this car. So these cars got really fast back in 2018 when people realized that these transmissions could be tuned. And man, I tell you what, the 10-speed, it always feels busy when you're driving it. It does take some getting used to, but in terms of being fast, this 10-speed is absolutely fantastic because it always keeps you in the power band. And because of the way this car makes power all on the high end, it does a better job of keeping this car in the power band and really letting this car put the power down effectively. So while the 6-speed, as I mentioned, is kind of a weakness for this car, the 10-speed in this car is absolutely fantastic and a huge reason why this thing is really fast. Now, the fourth thing I want to talk about, and another reason I really like the Mustang, is really for the dash. Now, I need to kind of mention, this does not have the 401A dash in it. I couldn't find a car that had that, but my blue one had the 401A dash, and it's an all-digital dash. And I really do love that option in the Mustang. I think the 401A is fantastic. I also like the fact that you can do my color in here, and I know the Camaros can kind of do the same thing. The Mopars don't have that option, but you can actually change your entire theme in here. You can change change your gauge colors, all sorts of stuff like that. But the digital dash that goes all the way across here in the 401A, I'm a huge fan of that. I think it is fantastic. I love the way, like I said, you can change the colors around on it, and it's just a really neat digital display for an American car. So yeah, this doesn't have the 401A, but it is an option in the Mustang, and I think it's a great option. So one more reason to love the Mustang. And really the big thing and the last thing I want to talk about is just really power per dollar. So the Mustang has always been a really solid value for the amount of power that you get, and this is absolutely no exception. Obviously, we know the horsepower went down for 2022 to 450 instead of 460, like this car started out as. But I mean, when you talk about a car that makes 460 horsepower and the fact that it stickers for well under $40,000, that's a lot of power for a relatively small amount of money, especially when you consider all the other stuff that's out there, the imports, even some of the domestic stuff. This thing is a real bargain when it comes to power. And as I mentioned, if you like building a really fast car on a budget, this may be an absolutely fantastic option for you there as well. So, all right, guys, that about does it. As I mentioned, I've had a few months now to kind of get this thing a little bit more figured out, and I really do enjoy this Ford Mustang. I'm still learning the car in terms of how much power is in it, the right way to get a lot of power out of it and put it all down effectively. It does take a little bit of seat time, but hopefully you guys got some enjoyment out of this. Like I said, 5 things I love, 5 things I hate, and maybe if you're out there trying to make a decision on a Ford Mustang, maybe this will help a little bit. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'll catch you on the next one. So until then, RacerX.